Operation Jackpot was a major federal drug investigation in the early 1980s that caught South Carolina's gentlemen marijuana smugglers. These were unique smugglers in that they were non-violent, and they were also college educated. They dropped out of college in the late 60s and early 70s to pursue smuggling careers, traveling first to Florida, then came back up the coast to South Carolina when law enforcement heat got too heavy in South Florida. In South Carolina, they found a smuggler's paradise. There was mile after mile of marsh with tons of inlets and rivers for them to bring in boats packed full of pot. They rarely got caught, and it wasn't until the early 1980s when a federal investigation was launched to try and find these men. The government wasn't sure who was smuggling, they just knew someone was, and that someone was making a lot of money. So they started a financial investigation called Operation Jackpot, tracking down real estate purchases and luxury car purchases to find out who these smugglers were. Eventually, they caught and convicted more than 100 marijuana smugglers, tracking some of them down in manhunts that stretched from Australia to California. I spent a lot of time talking about two kingpins, Barry Foy and Les Riley. Both moved to South Florida in the early 70s, but came back to South Carolina to begin their kingpin years. They were wild, crazy. They decided to take boats to Jamaica, Colombia, Lebanon. There was nowhere really that they wouldn't go as long as they could make some money. But even though they were so crazy, they were also principled. They refused to carry guns and would not engage in violence. They always reasoned there was more money to be made, so why hurt a potential business partner?
How did they get into drug smuggling?
They were a little bit bored with life. They didn't want to follow in the footsteps of their fathers, who were bankers, businessmen, barbers. They wanted more adventure and excitement. They loved to travel, and they loved the lifestyle that drug smuggling could afford them. They would bring the drugs in through, always would find isolated coastline with docks. Often they would have backup spots, so in case law enforcement patrols were in one area, they had a backup. The perfect place would be somewhere that was far from development, far from any kind of major urban population, where they could bring a couple trucks, load it with pot, put them back on the road towards major cities.
So you said that the government started going after major purchases like cars and boats, and what exactly were they looking for? How did they know that these men just weren't well-to-do?
Well, they were a little young to be owning homes on St. Bart's, Nantucket, Cape Cod, and along the South Carolina coast on Hilton Head, for example, which was beginning to be a resort community. They're also a little young to be driving Mercedes Goldwings, Rolls-Royce vehicles, and owning some of the finest sailboats in the world. A few of them were fond of wearing fur coats and gold jewelry. They stuck out, but in places like Miami that was awash with drug smugglers, they could blend in a little bit. But when they came home to South Carolina, they kind of stuck out like a sore thumb. The day that the Jackpot indictments were unsealed, kingpins were all across the world hiding. A number of smugglers were rounded up, but the big guys could not be found. It would take months and in some cases years to find some of these kingpins, tracking them down to Australia, New York City, La Jolla, California, and Denver, Colorado. The manhunts were intensive and relied on the testimony of former friends to find these men. The trials also lasted for a couple weeks at a time, but stretched over a period of years. Many of the kingpins could not be found when the initial trials started, but the evidence at home was building up against them as more and more of their former business partners testified against them and evidence was presented of the crimes committed. By the time they were finally caught, few of the kingpins' cases actually went to trial because they were cooked. Kingpin is a formal term, and there's a kingpin statute which requires at least 10 years in prison. So at a minimum, these kingpins all received 10 years. Some received 25-year sentences. One received 40-year sentences, and he ended up dying in prison. Because there was a possibility of parole, many of the kingpins ended up doing less time than they were actually sentenced, but still spent 10, 15, 17, 20 years in prison. Now the kingpins, some of them have passed away, but others are still alive, leading lives that are much quieter than the ones they had previously had. Their lives today lack the glamour and excitement of years past, but nevertheless they have interesting stories to tell and are happy to share them.
How did you come across this story?
I had met a smuggler's daughter a few years back, and she had not seen her father in about 25 years owing to his status as a fugitive. He had fled in 1983 and was not caught again until 2008 when he was caught coming across the border from Mexico. His story was amazing in itself, but he was only one of the many gentlemen marijuana smugglers. I heard the story and I was intrigued, so I began investigating. I learned he was not the only marijuana smuggler. There were dozens like him, and he was a minnow among marlins. There were men with the names of Bob the Boss, Tom Rolex Road, Barry Flash Foy. You couldn't make it all up, and I was amazed that no one had written a book yet.
And this this is your first book. How did you find the experience?
Very satisfying. It was a pleasure to sit down with people on both sides of the law to hear the exciting stories, whether they were surviving hurricanes, seeing Israeli jets go overhead as they picked up hashish in Beirut, Lebanon during the middle of a civil war, or to hear from the law enforcement agents about these many manhunts. All of it was a lot of fun.